Sometime in the early hours of January 18, 1995, a section of rock deep beneath the Japanese city of Kobe stopped holding. The Nojima Fault, a structure that had been locked, compressed, and accumulating stress for approximately 1,000 years, released approximately 2.5 meters of lateral displacement in roughly 15 seconds. By 6 o'clock that morning, 6,434 people were dead. More than 250,000 buildings were destroyed or damaged, and one of the most sophisticated modern cities on Earth had been reduced in its downtown core to something resembling photographs from the Second World War. The Japanese had a word ready: Hanshin Daishinsai, the Great Hanshin Earthquake. What they did not have, and what no government has ever successfully produced, is a reliable method of knowing when a fault that has been quiet for 1,000 years has decided to stop being quiet. The Nojima Fault gave no warning. There were no foreshocks of significance. There was no measurable change in groundwater chemistry in the days preceding. There was nothing. And that is not the unsettling part. The unsettling part is what seismologists discovered when they looked at the fault's behavior in the months and years leading up to that January morning. A pattern of microseismic activity, of subtle stress redistribution, of slow slip events at depth, that in retrospect was consistent with a system approaching failure. They simply did not know what they were looking at until after the city was gone. The Cascadia subduction zone sits off the coast of the Pacific Northwest of North America and is one of the most thoroughly studied and simultaneously most poorly understood seismic structures on the planet. It runs approximately 1,100 kilometers from Northern California to southern British Columbia, and along its entire length, the Juan de Fuca Oceanic Plate is being forced beneath the North American continental plate at a rate of roughly 4 centimeters per year. That number sounds small. Over 500 years, the approximate recurrence interval for full margin ruptures on this fault, it translates to 2 meters of accumulated strain. The last full rupture Cascadia earthquake occurred on January 26, 1700, at approximately 9 o'clock in the evening local time. The evidence for this date is not ambiguous. It comes from Japanese tsunami records that documented an orphan tsunami arriving from the east with no corresponding earthquake in Japan, from Native American oral traditions that describe entire coastal villages being swallowed by the ocean, from drowned ghost forests along the Oregon coast where trees killed by sudden land subsidence still stand in tidal marshes, and from dendrochronology of those trees, which shows growth rings stopping at exactly that year. The magnitude of that earthquake is estimated at between 9.0 and 9.2. Seattle did not exist yet. Portland did not exist yet. Vancouver did not exist yet. They do now, and they sit on the same plate, above the same fault, waiting for the same stress release that has occurred repeatedly over the past 10,000 years of geological record. Brian Atwater of the United States Geological Survey spent years wading through coastal marshes in Oregon and Washington, collecting cores from the sediment. And what he found was a stratigraphic record that reads like a repeated nightmare. Buried beneath the surface, at intervals corresponding to roughly 200 to 500 years, he found the same sequence again and again. A layer of soil containing the roots of terrestrial plants, then an abrupt transition to marine sediment, indicating sudden subsidence of the coastline, then a layer of sand deposited by an incoming tsunami wave, then gradual recovery and re-establishment of terrestrial vegetation, then another buried soil horizon, and another abrupt transition. The pattern repeats at least 7 times in the record, each repetition representing a full Cascadia rupture. When Atwater examined the most recent buried soil, the one corresponding to the 1700 event, and compared it to the surface soil being deposited today, he found the following. The modern soil profile is developing in a way that is broadly comparable to the period preceding the 1700 rupture. The region is approximately 325 years into an interseismic period that may last anywhere from 100 to 900 years. Whether that means the next rupture is decades away or centuries away is genuinely unknown. The San Andreas Fault carries a different kind of history, one documented not just through geological proxies, but through the direct and catastrophic memory of living cities. On April 18, 1906, at 12 minutes past 5 in the morning, approximately 470 kilometers of the fault ruptured simultaneously. The northernmost section, running beneath the San Francisco Bay Area, moved as much as 6 meters in some places. The earthquake lasted between 45 and 60 seconds. The fires that followed burned for 3 days. Between 3,000 and 6,000 people died. The imprecision in that number is itself a historical tragedy, as many of the dead were poor immigrants whose deaths were not fully recorded. Much of San Francisco was destroyed. The physical scar of that rupture is still visible in the landscape of the Bay Area. It runs through the Crystal Springs Reservoir, through the hills of Marin County, through the geography of a region that now contains approximately 8 million people. The average recurrence interval for major ruptures on the northernmost section of the San Andreas appears to be roughly 150 to 200 years. As of 2025, the last major rupture in that segment was 119 years ago. The stress is accumulating at approximately 46 millimeters per year. The mathematics of that situation require no interpretation. Paleoseismology, the discipline that reads earthquake history from the sediment record rather than from instruments, has in the past 4 decades fundamentally transformed our understanding of fault behavior, and the picture it has revealed is more disturbing than the one we had before. Before paleoseismology matured as a discipline, the understanding of major faults was largely based on historical records and instrumental seismology, both of which cover at most a few centuries, and in most regions considerably less. When Carey C. of Caltech began excavating trenches across the San Andreas in the 1970s, examining the sediment layers deformed by past earthquakes, he discovered something that historical records could not have revealed. The fault has been rupturing roughly every 130 to 150 years for as far back as the stratigraphic record allows, which is approximately 2,000 years. More significantly, the stress accumulated since 1906 is already approaching the stress levels that preceded the 1906 rupture itself. The fault is not simply approaching a future rupture at some indefinite point. It is approaching the specific stress state that produced the event whose aftermath we still remember. The Hayward Fault in the East Bay of the San Francisco region is in some ways more immediately alarming than the San Andreas, because its geometry and location produce a different kind of risk. It runs directly beneath the densely urbanized cities of Oakland, Berkeley, Fremont, and Hayward, through downtown areas where much of the building stock predates modern seismic codes. Its last major rupture occurred in 1868, producing a magnitude estimated at between 6.8 and 7.0, an earthquake that destroyed much of Hayward and San Leandro, and was described at the time as the Big One. In 1868, the combined population of the East Bay was roughly 50,000 people. Today, the population of Alameda and Contra Costa counties alone exceeds 2.5 million, with much of that population living in unreinforced masonry buildings, soft-story apartments, and structures built on bay fill, artificial land reclaimed from San Francisco Bay that behaves during shaking in a process called liquefaction, converting from solid ground to something closer to liquid under seismic stress. The United States Geological Survey's estimate, published in the Uniform California Earthquake Rupture Forecast, suggests a 33% probability of a magnitude 6.7 or greater earthquake on the Hayward-Rogers Creek fault system within the next 30 years. What makes fault behavior genuinely mysterious, not in the mystified sense but in the precise scientific sense of exceeding current predictive models, is the phenomenon of silent slip. GPS networks monitoring crustal deformation along major fault systems in California, Cascadia, Japan, and New Zealand have detected something that contradicts the simple model of faults as locked, uniformly stressed structures that fail catastrophically at a predictable threshold. Some fault segments, instead of building stress continuously until rupture, periodically release stress through slow slip events. Episodes of fault movement that occur over days or weeks, producing little or no seismicity, generating ground deformation measurable only by sensitive GPS instruments, and transferring stress to adjacent locked segments. The Cascadia subduction zone does this on a remarkably regular schedule. Slow slip events in the deep portions of the fault occur approximately every 14 months, each one transferring stress upward onto the shallow locked zone where the next megathrust earthquake will originate. Geodetic monitoring has documented these events precisely. What monitoring cannot yet determine is whether any particular slow slip event is simply another in a long series of harmless episodic tremors, or whether it is the final stress increment that will trigger rupture in the locked zone above. The difference between those two outcomes, for the cities of the Pacific Northwest, is the difference between another 14 months and an event that reshapes the regional landscape. The 1960 Valdivia earthquake in Chile remains the most powerful seismically recorded event in human history, with a magnitude of 9.5. It occurred on May 22nd at approximately 3 in the afternoon, and it lasted approximately 10 minutes. The rupture length extended approximately 1,000 kilometers along the Chilean subduction zone. The resulting tsunami killed people as far away as Hawaii, Japan, and the Philippines. The Chilean city of Valdivia was effectively destroyed. Buildings collapsed, fires broke out, and the subsequent land subsidence permanently altered the regional geography. What makes this event particularly relevant is the paleoseismic record of the same subduction zone. Analysis of coastal sediments, of drowned forests, and of lake sediment cores from Chile has revealed the following. The Valdivia segment of the subduction zone ruptures in great earthquakes on a recurrence interval of somewhere between 100 and 300 years. The previous major rupture before 1960 occurred in 1737, with an estimated magnitude of 9.5 as well. The one before that occurred in 1647. The pattern of rupture, interseismic accumulation, and catastrophic release has been occurring for thousands of years. The 1960 earthquake was not an anomaly. It was a scheduled event that arrived on geological schedule. The North Anatolian Fault in Turkey provides what may be the most disturbing single data set in the history of observational seismology, a record of sequential rupture that has been systematically advancing westward toward Istanbul for nearly 90 years. Beginning in 1939 with a magnitude 7.8 earthquake near Erzincan that killed approximately 32,000 people, the fault has produced a series of major earthquakes marching progressively westward along its length. 1942, 1943, 1944, 1951, 1957, 1967, 1999. The 1999 Izmit earthquake, at magnitude 7.6, killed over 17,000 people and occurred within 120 kilometers of Istanbul. Seismologists examining the fault's behavior after Izmit determined the following. The stress that was released at Izmit was transferred to the next westward segment, a segment that runs directly beneath the Marmara Sea, immediately south of Istanbul. Current GPS measurements indicate that the Marmara segment is accumulating strain at approximately 2.5 centimeters per year and has not produced a major earthquake since approximately 14th century. Istanbul has a population of approximately 15 to 18 million people. A significant fraction of its building stock, particularly in older districts, consists of unreinforced masonry. The probabilistic seismic hazard assessment for Istanbul gives approximately 40 to 65% probability of a major earthquake affecting the city within the next 30 years. The question that sits underneath all of this data, underneath the buried soils and the drowned forests and the GPS displacement vectors and the paleoseismic trenches, is the following. Why do civilizations continue to build major cities directly on or adjacent to these structures? Often with inadequate seismic codes, often with populations that have no lived memory of the fault's last major event, and often with infrastructure that cannot withstand what the geological record clearly demonstrates will eventually occur. The answer is not ignorance, at least not entirely. After 1906, San Francisco rebuilt on the same ground. After the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake killed between 140,000 and 150,000 people in Tokyo and Yokohama, Tokyo rebuilt on the same ground. After Kobe in 1995, the city rebuilt. After the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami killed approximately 15,900 people and triggered the Fukushima nuclear disaster, the coastal communities of Tohoku rebuilt, some of them in the exact same locations. This is not irrationality, or rather, it is a specific kind of rationality. The rationality of a species that operates on timescales of decades rather than centuries, that discounts future catastrophe against the concrete advantages of existing location and infrastructure, and that has a neurological incapacity for visceral fear of events outside personal memory. What seismology has learned from instrumented monitoring of faults in the decades since the establishment of global seismic networks is simultaneously more and less reassuring than earlier models suggested. More reassuring in the following sense. The behavior of fault systems is not purely random, and the patterns of seismicity, geodetic strain accumulation, and slow slip that precede major ruptures are in principle detectable. Less reassuring in the following sense. The lead time between detectable precursory signals and catastrophic rupture is, in the best documented cases, on the order of seconds to minutes rather than days to weeks. The Parkfield Prediction Experiment, the most ambitious attempt in the history of seismology to predict a specific earthquake on a specific fault segment, monitored a section of the San Andreas that had produced magnitude 6 earthquakes at intervals of approximately 22 years in 1857, 1881, 1901, 1922, 1934, and 1966. The prediction was that the next Parkfield earthquake would occur between 1985 and 1993. It occurred in 2004. The dense network of instruments arrayed around the predicted rupture zone detected no reliable precursory signal before the earthquake. The rupture initiated without warning that any instrument could have translated into actionable advance notice. The geological record of fault behavior extends back far enough in some regions to reveal something that the historical record and the instrumental record cannot. The existence of clustered earthquake sequences, sometimes called supercycles, in which periods of elevated seismic activity on a fault system are separated by periods of comparative quiescence lasting centuries or millennia. The recognition of this clustering behavior has significant implications for seismic hazard assessment because it suggests that the simple Poisson model of earthquake occurrence, in which each earthquake is independent of previous ones and future probability depends only on elapsed time since the last event, is incorrect. Fault systems appear to communicate with one another through stress transfer, through viscoelastic relaxation of the lower crust and upper mantle, and through mechanisms that are not yet fully understood. A major earthquake on one fault can increase the stress on adjacent faults, sometimes producing secondary failures within months. The 1992 Landers earthquake in California triggered seismicity across the western United States, including increased seismic activity at Yellowstone, approximately 1,200 kilometers away. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake produced detectable seismic effects at distances of thousands of kilometers and may have triggered increased volcanic activity at several sites in Japan within days of the main event. Faults do not behave as isolated systems. They are coupled, interactive elements of a continuous tectonic network, and the behavior of any one element reflects and influences the state of the network as a whole. What the geological record ultimately reveals, stripped of the language of hazard assessment and probabilistic forecasting, is something closer to an ecological observation. Major fault systems are not geological anomalies or disasters in waiting. They are normal features of a tectonically active planet, operating on schedules set by the physics of plate motion and crustal rheology, entirely indifferent to the civilizations that have accumulated above them. The cities that sit on these faults are, from the perspective of geological time, extraordinarily recent features. Most of them have existed for less than a single interseismic cycle on the faults beneath them. San Francisco has existed for approximately 1 fault cycle. Istanbul has existed for approximately 8, but most of its modern building stock has existed for less than 1. The Pacific Northwest cities have existed for approximately 1/4 to 1/3 of a Cascadia interseismic period. From the fault's perspective, if one can anthropomorphize a tectonic structure, the cities are temporary guests in a landscape that was being remade by seismic rupture for millions of years before the first foundations were poured, and will continue to be remade for millions of years after the last building has been forgotten. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan presents a particular case study in the failure of prediction despite extraordinary scientific sophistication. Japan possesses perhaps the densest network of seismic monitoring equipment on the planet, a system established and refined over decades following the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake that destroyed Tokyo and Yokohama. The Earthquake Research Committee, established by the Japanese government in the late 1990s, had assessed the probability of a major earthquake on the Japan Trench subduction zone, where the Pacific Plate descends beneath the North American Plate in the offshore region east of Sendai, at approximately 20% over the following 30 years. That assessment was based on historical records dating back approximately 1,300 years and on paleoseismic evidence from coastal sediments. The assessment was therefore reasonable given the available data. The magnitude 9.0 earthquake that occurred on March 11, 2011, far exceeded the expected magnitude. The rupture extended approximately 170 kilometers perpendicular to the trench axis and approximately 500 kilometers parallel to it. The vertical component of the seafloor displacement reached approximately 4 meters in some areas. The tsunami that followed killed approximately 15,900 people, many of them far more than what pre-event models had calculated would affect inland areas. The paleoseismic record, when examined after the event by researchers at the University of Tokyo and other institutions, revealed the following. The Japan Trench subduction zone appears to produce megathrust earthquakes of magnitude 9.0 or greater on a recurrence interval of somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years. The previous event of similar magnitude appears to have occurred approximately 1,100 years before 2011, placing it in the early 11th century. The historical record of Japan contains no description of a tsunami of the magnitude that occurred in 2011 occurring in historical times. The event, in retrospect, was not unprecedented. It was simply beyond the scope of what historical memory, or even instrumental memory, had recorded. It was the kind of event that geological records are designed to reveal, and it revealed something crucial. Major subduction zone earthquakes can exceed, by a significant margin, the magnitudes recorded in historical records. The Tohoku earthquake fundamentally altered Japanese seismic hazard assessments, not just for the Japan Trench, but for all the subduction zones surrounding the Japanese islands. And the probability of another such event on a different subduction zone was immediately recognized as substantially higher than previous assessments had indicated. What emerges from examining the paleoseismic records of major faults around the world is a pattern that is consistent and disturbing. Throughout the geological record, reaching back hundreds of thousands of years in some cases, major faults have displayed a behavior that seismologists call quasi-periodic rupture. This means that while the timing of individual ruptures varies, the long-term average recurrence interval is stable enough to be statistically meaningful. The New Madrid seismic zone in the central United States, which produced one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded in North America in 1811, an event whose magnitude is estimated between 7.5 and 8.5, and which was felt across nearly the entire eastern United States, appears to produce great earthquakes on a recurrence interval of somewhere between 300 and 500 years. The previous major event appears to have occurred somewhere in the period between 1300 and 1400, based on sand blows in the paleoseismic record and on tentative correlation with Native American oral traditions. The next one is not imminent by geological standards, but the region's most recent major seismic activity, between 2010 and 2011, produced a swarm of earthquakes in a region previously thought to be relatively stable, and raised the question, unanswered to this day, of whether these swarms represent stress redistribution leading toward a future megathrust, or whether they represent background noise in a region whose major ruptures occur on timescales measured in centuries, rather than in the continuous activity we might expect if the system were approaching failure. The problem of prediction becomes, when examined carefully, a problem of recognition. Seismologists can identify the physical state that precedes a rupture. The issue is that this identification is retrospective. After an earthquake, the precursory signals are obvious. Before an earthquake, they are indistinguishable from background noise. The 1995 Kobe earthquake, referenced at the beginning of this account, destroyed a major metropolitan area despite occurring in a nation with extraordinary seismic expertise and monitoring capability. The Nojima fault, which ruptured in that earthquake, had displayed no obvious precursory activity that could be distinguished from normal crustal noise. Years later, when seismologists re-examined data from the months and weeks before the earthquake, they identified a pattern of subtle changes in microseismic activity and in geodetic strain that could be interpreted as precursory to the rupture. The problem was not that the signals were absent. The problem was that their signal-to-noise ratio was too low to actionably distinguish them from background variations at the time they were occurring. By the time the pattern became statistically significant, it was too late to act on the information. The Pacific Northwest exists in a state that is, from one perspective, fortunate. The Cascadia subduction zone produces great earthquakes at intervals of roughly 300 to 500 years, and the last such rupture was approximately 325 years ago. From another perspective, this is precisely the problem. The interval is long enough that modern cities were built without experienced knowledge of what the fault can do. Seattle did not experience a significant earthquake during its first 100 years of settlement. The most recent major seismic event affecting western Washington was the 1965 earthquake in Puget Sound, which had a magnitude of 6.7 and was felt throughout the region, but caused minimal structural damage to modern buildings. That earthquake reinforced a false sense of security, the belief that earthquakes in the Pacific Northwest, while possible, would be modest in magnitude, and that the region's building codes, already stricter than those in many parts of the United States, were more than adequate for the real risk. The paleoseismic record, which was not widely understood or publicized until the 1980s and 90s, revealed something different. The slow slip events occurring every 14 months on the deep portion of the Cascadia Fault are thought to represent the behavior of the fault during the interseismic period. When the locked shallow zone ruptures, models suggest that the rupture will propagate upward with an initial slip that may exceed 6 meters in some areas. The tsunami generated by such an event will reach some coastal areas, particularly along the Oregon coast, within approximately 15 to 20 minutes. The recurrence interval of 300 to 500 years is, by human standards, very long. By the standards of a region's building codes, which are typically designed with a 50-year or 100-year horizon in mind, it is catastrophically long. Buildings designed with a presumed maximum seismic event based on instrumental records that span only decades will be subjected to forces many times greater than those their design accounted for. The human response to this knowledge has been interesting and revealing. In the 2 decades since the serious implications of the Cascadia subduction zone's paleoseismic record became clear, building codes in Oregon and Washington have been updated substantially. Unreinforced masonry buildings have been retrofitted or demolished. New construction is subject to stricter lateral force requirements. Schools, hospitals, and bridges have been evaluated, and many have been strengthened. The utilities, particularly power companies and water districts, have undertaken detailed planning for what the recovery from a major Cascadia rupture would look like. Insurance companies have adjusted their models. Emergency management agencies have developed response protocols. All of this is rational, all of it is necessary, and all of it remains, when examined against what the geological record actually predicts, vastly inadequate. The reason is not that the planning is insufficient or that the engineering is wrong. The reason is simpler and more fundamental. The cities themselves, the accumulated infrastructure, the population centers, the economic assets, cannot be moved. The problem cannot be prevented. It can only be mitigated. And mitigation is fundamentally limited when one is attempting to engineer permanence in structures that sit on a fault zone where periodic reassembly of the landscape is not a possibility that might occur, but a certainty that will occur. The only uncertainty being when. The question of why civilizations continue to build on these faults, despite knowing what the faults will eventually do, reveals something about human decision-making that deserves examination. The simple explanation that people are not rational does not hold up to scrutiny. The inhabitants of coastal California, coastal Oregon, the Tokyo-Yokohama region, the Istanbul area, and the countless other zones of high seismic risk are not notably less intelligent than the inhabitants of seismically stable regions. They are not making decisions in ignorance, at least not entirely. They are making decisions based on what economists call time preference, the systematic tendency of human brains to weight immediate and concrete benefits more heavily than distant and probabilistic risks. Building in San Francisco provides immediate economic advantage. Proximity to other businesses, existing infrastructure, established networks of commerce and culture. The risk of a major earthquake is real, but it is, from the perspective of any individual decision-maker, a low probability event that may not occur during their lifetime or their children's lifetimes. The probability of the next major San Andreas rupture in the San Francisco segment is estimated at approximately 41% over the next 30 years. That is a high probability by seismic standards. It is a probability that means the earthquake is not guaranteed to occur. It may not occur during the next 30 years, and any individual living through those 30 years has a 59% chance of not experiencing it. When one factors in the possibility of surviving an earthquake, even if it occurs, and the economic value of living in a location like San Francisco, the rational calculation becomes more complex. It becomes possible to understand why even people who know about the risk choose to remain in or move to these locations. There is, however, another dimension to this problem, one that becomes visible when one examines the behavior of governments and institutions rather than individuals. Governments, theoretically, operate on timescales longer than individual human lives. Governments can make long-term investments in infrastructure. Governments have access to capital markets. Governments have the power to mandate building codes and enforcement mechanisms. Yet governments continue to permit and even subsidize development in high-risk seismic zones. After the 1995 Kobe earthquake, the Japanese government spent approximately $100 billion in reconstruction. Much of this reconstruction occurred in Kobe itself, rebuilding the port, the transportation networks, the urban infrastructure in the same location. The question of whether Kobe should be partially relocated to a less seismically active region was briefly raised and then dismissed. The reason offered was economic. Kobe's port is one of the most important in Japan, and the location, in geographic terms, is irreplaceable. What was replaced was the buildings, the infrastructure, the population. Another great earthquake will occur on the faults beneath Kobe or somewhere else in Japan. When it does, it will destroy or damage what has been rebuilt, and the cycle will repeat. This is not irrationality at the governmental level. It is a different kind of rationality, one that prioritizes the continuity of existing infrastructure and economic systems over the long-term protection of populations from risks that cannot ultimately be eliminated. The mechanics of why cities continue to be built in the same locations, despite the certainty that those locations will be struck by devastating earthquakes, reveals itself through examining the problem of relocation. If the government of Washington State, faced with the evidence that Cascadia subduction zone will eventually produce an earthquake that will cause tremendous damage to Seattle, decided to relocate Seattle to a location far from any major fault, several immediate practical problems would arise. First, there is nowhere in Western North America that is entirely free from seismic risk. The entire western margin of the continent is tectonically active. Any location that avoided the Cascadia subduction zone would still face risk from other faults, including smaller subduction zones and strike-slip faults. Second, the cost of such a relocation would be economically catastrophic. Not merely the cost of moving buildings, though that alone would be in the trillions of dollars, but the cost of relocating the port infrastructure, the air transportation systems, the manufacturing and distribution networks that are tied to Seattle's specific location. Third, the human cost of asking millions of people to abandon the city where they and their families have established lives, businesses, social networks, and cultural institutions is not a calculation that any government has found acceptable or even truly conceivable. Fourth, and most importantly, the relocation would not solve the problem at a larger scale. The entire Pacific Northwest would still face risk. The population would simply be relocated to another seismic zone, requiring another relocation in turn. What Seattle demonstrates is that the risk of major earthquakes is not a risk that can be eliminated by moving. It is a risk that is inherent to living on a tectonically active planet. The only question is which faults one chooses to live on. Istanbul presents a particular case study in this regard because it is a city that faces, arguably, the single most dangerous seismic situation of any major metropolitan area on Earth. The city is located on the boundary between the Anatolian Plate and the Eurasian Plate, a zone of complex strike-slip faulting. The North Anatolian Fault, which passes directly beneath the Marmara Sea immediately south and east of the city, is in what appears to be a late stage of an earthquake cycle. The Izmit earthquake of 1999 transferred stress directly to the segment beneath the Marmara Sea. GPS measurements show this segment is accumulating strain at approximately 25 millimeters per year. The paleoseismic record suggests this segment produces major earthquakes at intervals of approximately 500 years. The last major rupture appears to have occurred in approximately 1400, making the current interseismic period approximately 600 years long. By paleoseismic standards, this makes the next rupture overdue. The probabilistic seismic hazard assessment for Istanbul, published by the Turkish government and by international seismic organizations, suggests a probability of between 40 and 65% for a magnitude 7.0 or greater earthquake in the next 30 years. Istanbul is a city of 15 to 18 million people, one of the largest metropolitan areas in the world. A significant fraction of its building stock, particularly in the older districts and in the informal settlements that have grown up on the margins, consists of unreinforced or minimally reinforced masonry construction built to standards that would be considered inadequate by modern seismic codes. A major earthquake affecting Istanbul would potentially kill hundreds of thousands of people and cause economic damage in the hundreds of billions of dollars. The Turkish government is aware of this risk. International seismic organizations have made the risk clear. Seismic engineers have documented the problem in detail. Istanbul continues to grow. The population continues to expand. The building stock continues to be developed. The risk is managed through incremental improvement, building code updates, retrofit programs, emergency planning. But the fundamental problem remains unaddressed because it cannot be addressed. Istanbul cannot be relocated. The economic and political consequences of such a relocation would be incalculable. Therefore, the city remains where it is, on a fault that will eventually rupture in a manner that will cause catastrophic damage, and society prepares as best it can for an event that will test that preparation to its limits. What the geological record reveals, when examined carefully, is that human civilization has established itself on a planet in the middle of a recurring seismic catastrophe that operates on timescales of centuries to millennia. The intervals between these catastrophes are long enough that human civilizations have time to develop amnesia about them. A city can be destroyed, rebuilt, and grow to the point where no one in the population remembers the previous destruction. Children born 50 years after a major earthquake will know it only as history. Children born 150 years after an earthquake will know nothing of it but what historians tell them. By the time the geological recurrence interval brings the next event, the memory of the previous event has faded enough that it can be collectively decided that the old knowledge is not as important as the immediate economic and practical advantages of rebuilding in the same place. This is not a failure of knowledge or of science. It is a failure of human timescale perception. Human brains evolved to operate on timescales of days, months, and years. Timescales of centuries and millennia are not intuitively graspable. It is possible to understand them intellectually, to work with the numbers and the statistics, but it is not possible to feel them the way one feels the concrete reality of immediate risk. A person living in San Francisco can read all the scientific literature about the San Andreas Fault, can understand intellectually that a major rupture is not a matter of if, but of when, and can still choose to remain in San Francisco because the immediate concrete benefits, the job, the social network, the cultural capital, the life that has been built there, feel more real than a statistical probability of a future event. The advances in paleoseismology over the past 4 decades have fundamentally altered the picture of what major faults can do, but they have not altered the fundamental problem of what to do about that knowledge. The problem is that the knowledge reveals, in excruciatingly precise detail, that the faults are going to rupture again, that the ruptures will cause tremendous damage, and that there is no way to prevent the ruptures or to relocate the populations at risk. What can be done is to build structures that are more resistant to earthquake damage, to develop better emergency response systems, to improve the ability to recover from the damage that will occur. But these mitigation measures, while necessary and valuable, cannot solve the fundamental problem. They can only reduce the magnitude of the disaster when it occurs. And they can do this only to a limited degree, because there are physical limits to how much additional seismic resistance can be engineered into buildings without making them economically impossible to construct or inhabit. A building that is designed to withstand a magnitude 9.0 earthquake will cost substantially more to build than a building designed for a magnitude 7.0 earthquake. If the probability of the magnitude 9 is low enough, and the probability of not experiencing one's entire lifetime without it is high enough, then the economic calculus suggests that the additional cost is not justified. The problem returns, in a different form, to the same fundamental issue: human time preference, and the difficulty of making decisions based on risks that, while certain to occur eventually, are not guaranteed to occur during any specific human lifetime. The study of faults that have not ruptured in recorded human history reveals a particular kind of problem: the problem of inherited risk. The Cascade Range in Oregon and Washington contains numerous volcanic peaks, and beneath them lie systems of faults that show evidence of past ruptures in the paleoseismic record, but have produced no recorded earthquakes in the time that human civilization has existed in the region. These faults present a risk that is real. They will eventually rupture again, and when they do, the rupture will affect the region. But the risk is not visibly immediate because there is no instrumentation showing accumulating stress. No recorded ruptures in the past century or even the past millennium that would create a sense of urgency. These faults are in what seismologists call the quiescent phase of an interseismic cycle. They are accumulating stress so slowly, or the stress accumulated is being released so gradually through creep and small earthquakes, that the visual and instrumental signature is minimal. But the paleoseismic record shows that they have ruptured before and will rupture again. The question of when is essentially unanswerable. It could be centuries away, or it could be decades away. The geological record does not provide high temporal resolution at that level of precision. What we know is that these faults represent real risks, that cities built above them will someday experience major earthquakes, and that society must make decisions about how to account for these risks without being able to say exactly when they will materialize. The recognition that fault systems operate as networked systems rather than as independent units has fundamentally altered the conceptual framework in which seismic hazard is assessed. The 1992 Landers earthquake in California, which had a magnitude of 7.3, triggered a sequence of earthquakes across much of the western United States. Some of these triggered earthquakes occurred within hours or days of the main shock, clearly initiated by stress transfer from the Landers rupture. Others occurred months or even years later, making the causal connection less obvious but still plausible. The recognition that faults communicate with one another through stress transfer means that assessing the hazard from one fault cannot be done in isolation from assessing the hazard from adjacent faults. A rupture on the San Andreas can increase the stress on the Hayward Fault. A rupture on the Hayward Fault can increase stress on the San Andreas or on other nearby faults. A rupture on the North Anatolian Fault in Turkey can increase stress on the Marmara segment and on faults further west. This networked behavior makes the problem of assessing seismic hazard substantially more complex than a simple analysis of individual faults would suggest. It also means that the occurrence of a major earthquake on one fault should, in principle, be followed by heightened vigilance on adjacent faults, because the stress transfer has increased the probability of rupture on those adjacent systems. What emerges from a careful study of paleoseismic and instrumental seismic data is a picture of a planet in which major faults behave according to physical principles that are understandable but not fully predictable in their specific details. The probability that a particular fault will rupture in a particular time window can be estimated based on the recurrence interval evident from the paleoseismic record and the elapsed time since the last rupture. But the probability that a particular rupture will occur on a particular day, or even in a particular year, cannot be estimated with useful precision. The deterministic question, will an earthquake occur, can be answered affirmatively given enough time. The probabilistic questions, what is the probability that it will occur within 30 years, or 10 years, or 1 year, can be estimated within broad ranges. But the predictive question, can we say 3 days in advance that an earthquake will occur, has so far proven to be beyond the capacity of seismology. This is not a failure of scientific understanding or of instrumentation. It is a reflection of the fact that the triggering of an earthquake is the culmination of a complex interplay of stress, material properties, fluid pressure, and other factors at scales that cannot all be monitored simultaneously. The precursory signals that theoretically should exist are so small relative to background noise that they cannot be distinguished from noise until long after the earthquake has already occurred. This is not a problem that can be solved by installing more seismometers or more sensitive GPS stations, because the problem is not a problem of measurement. It is a problem of the physical limits of what information about the future can be extracted from observations of the present. The question that remains is what we do with this knowledge. We know that major faults will rupture. We know that ruptures will cause tremendous damage. We know that we cannot predict the ruptures accurately enough to allow evacuation. We know that we cannot prevent the ruptures through any currently known mechanism. We know that we cannot move the cities away from the faults without creating other problems that might be worse than the seismic problem itself. Given all of this knowledge, what is the rational action? The answer, it appears, is to build structures that are as resistant to earthquake damage as engineering allows, to develop emergency response capabilities that can function after major earthquakes occur, to improve the resilience of critical infrastructure, to maintain insurance systems that can help with recovery, and to accept that some catastrophic loss of life and economic loss is inevitable. The rational action is, in other words, damage mitigation rather than risk elimination. The rational action is to make the disaster that will eventually occur as small as it can possibly be made, while accepting that the disaster will occur. This is not the kind of rational action that our intuitions about disasters typically envision. We imagine, when we think of responding to disasters, that there should be a way to prevent them. There should be a way to avoid the catastrophe entirely. The reality is that for the faults that underlie major cities, there is no such way. There is only the problem of living on a tectonically active planet and doing as well as possible while one does so. The history of earthquake engineering in the 20th century is a history of learning to accept increasingly uncomfortable truths about what is possible and what is not. In the immediate aftermath of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, the dominant response was denial. Denial that the earthquake had been as large as witnesses claimed. Denial that it could happen again. Denial that the damage could have been prevented through better building design. The damage, after all, had been attributed primarily to fire rather than to shaking, a distinction that allowed the narrative that the problem was not the earthquake itself, but the poor response to the earthquake's consequences. It was easier to tell a story about civic mismanagement of fire suppression than to confront the structural reality that buildings designed to 19th century standards could not withstand 20th century earthquakes. By the time of the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake in Tokyo, this convenient narrative had become harder to maintain. The 1923 earthquake destroyed approximately 140,000 to 150,000 people, a death toll so large that it could not be attributed primarily to fire. The shaking itself, in many cases, had been the direct cause of death through building collapse. Yet even with this evidence, the response in Tokyo was not a fundamental rethinking of the relationship between cities and seismic hazard. It was, instead, an incremental improvement in building standards combined with a resilience-based approach. Rebuild the city, incorporate what was learned, and accept that another such event would eventually occur. The development of the seismic code as a standardized approach to earthquake-resistant design represents one of the most successful engineering adaptations to geological hazard that has ever been created, and simultaneously one of the most expensive and resource-intensive commitments that any society can undertake. The early versions of seismic codes, developed in California in the 1920s and 30s following the 1906 earthquake, were based largely on intuition about how buildings should be braced and connected. Engineers observed the failure patterns in 1906 and made educated guesses about what modifications would prevent similar failures. Diagonal bracing, better connections between beams and columns, more robust foundations. These modifications were incorporated into new building codes without rigorous testing or analysis of whether they actually made buildings safer. It was not until the 1960s and 70s when shake table testing became possible. The ability to subject model structures or even full-scale structures to earthquake shaking, that engineers could actually verify whether their design assumptions were correct. Many assumptions turned out to be correct. Some turned out to be partially incorrect, leading to modifications in the codes. Others turned out to be entirely wrong, requiring wholesale revision of design philosophy. The development of capacity design philosophy, the approach of explicitly designing buildings so that plastic deformation, permanent bending and deformation of structural members, occurs in predetermined locations and in a controlled manner rather than in unpredictable failures, represented a fundamental shift in earthquake engineering thinking that became standard in Japan after the 1968 Tokaiji earthquake and gradually spread to the United States and Europe through the 1970s and 80s. The principle is simple in concept, but complex in execution. Rather than trying to make a building rigid enough to remain elastic, undamaged through an earthquake, engineers instead design the building to deform in specified ways, with energy being dissipated through controlled plastic deformation of materials specifically designed to accept such deformation while continuing to support the weight of the structure. This requires precise understanding of material properties, precise modeling of how forces distribute through the structure, and precise detailing of connections so that the deformation occurs where intended rather than in some other catastrophic location. A building designed using capacity design principles may appear severely damaged after a major earthquake. Permanent distortions of several centimeters in some elements, visible cracking in concrete, but the building remains standing and recovers from the earthquake without total collapse. The 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake in the San Francisco Bay Area, magnitude 6.9, located in the Santa Cruz Mountains, provided an unplanned but invaluable test of how well California's evolving seismic codes had worked. The earthquake occurred in a region where modern seismic code requirements had been in effect for decades, where much of the newer building stock had been designed for seismic loads, and where there existed both older buildings predating the codes and newer buildings designed according to the codes. The results were striking and informative. The newer buildings in San Francisco, Oakland, and the surrounding Bay Area communities, those designed according to seismic codes developed over the previous 2 decades, performed substantially better than older buildings. High-rise buildings designed with seismic considerations remained standing and returned to service within months. Older low-rise buildings, particularly unreinforced masonry construction, failed catastrophically in several instances. The collapse of the Cypress Street Viaduct in Oakland, which killed 42 people, was a reinforced concrete structure built in the 1950s before modern seismic design principles had been widely adopted. The failure pattern showed a classic soft-story collapse. The structure had a weak story where shear forces could not be adequately resisted, and the structure failed in that location. By 1989, engineers understood how to prevent soft-story collapses, yet the Cypress Viaduct had not been retrofitted to modern standards. The earthquake demonstrated both the progress that had been made and the incompleteness of that progress. a city that had suffered an earthquake 73 years earlier, that had built a seismic code based on that earlier earthquake, could still suffer significant structural failures and deaths when another earthquake struck because the codes had not been applied retroactively to all existing structures. The retrofit of existing buildings to modern seismic standards presents a problem that is both technically solvable and economically overwhelming. An unreinforced masonry building, the type that comprises a significant fraction of the housing stock in cities like Istanbul and still represents a notable fraction of older residential and commercial buildings in California, Japan, and other seismically active regions, can be retrofitted to survive a major earthquake. The retrofit might involve installing steel bracing inside the building, anchoring the walls to the foundation and to the floor systems, adding shear walls, or installing seismic dampers that allow the building to move during an earthquake while dissipating the energy of motion. The cost of retrofitting a single unreinforced masonry building can range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the size and complexity of the structure. A city with tens of thousands of such buildings faces a retrofit cost in the billions of dollars. Turkey has estimated that retrofitting the unreinforced masonry buildings in Istanbul alone would cost between $30 and $40 billion. The United States Geological Survey estimates that bringing the existing building stock of California to modern seismic standards would require on the order of $1 trillion, a number so large that it becomes abstract, detached from any realistic possibility of implementation. The problem, therefore, becomes not whether retrofitting is technically possible, but whether society can afford to do it. The decision-making process about which buildings to retrofit and in what order reveals the tension between scientific knowledge of risk and economic capacity. The approach typically taken by municipalities and governments is to prioritize the retrofit of critical facilities. Hospitals, fire stations, police stations, emergency operations centers, and structures that are essential to post-earthquake response. This makes sense from an emergency management perspective, but problematic from a seismic risk perspective. The buildings that pose the greatest risk to human life in a major earthquake are not the critical facilities, but the residential buildings where people sleep, where they spend most of their time. A hospital that is damaged in an earthquake but continues to function is a better outcome than a hospital that is destroyed, but it is not as good an outcome as residences that are not destroyed in the first place and therefore require less emergency medical care. Yet the economic calculus points in the direction of protecting the institutions rather than the residences, because the institutions can justify the retrofit cost through a professional cost-benefit analysis, while residences cannot. A single-family homeowner will not voluntarily spend $50,000 to retrofit a $200,000 house against an earthquake that has a 30% probability of occurring within the next 30 years. The retrofit cost is too high relative to the probability and the potential loss. A hospital administrator can justify retrofitting a building because the hospital is essential to emergency response, and the retrofit is therefore a legitimate use of public or institutional funds. The result is a somewhat inverted system, where the essential institutions are better protected than the places where people actually live. The question of building code enforcement, of ensuring that buildings are actually built according to the codes that exist, presents another layer of complexity that is often invisible in discussions of earthquake preparedness. Building codes are written by experts, reviewed by regulatory agencies, and adopted as law. But codes are only effective if they are enforced, and enforcement requires inspectors, permitting systems, and the institutional capacity to identify violations and require corrections. In seismically active regions of the developed world, California, Japan, New Zealand, and others, this institutional capacity generally exists, though it is often under-resourced and inconsistently applied. In developing countries with significant seismic hazard, including Turkey, parts of South America, parts of Southeast Asia, and others, the institutional capacity for code enforcement may be minimal or non-existent. Building codes may be officially adopted but unenforced. Developers and builders may cut corners on materials, on connections, on detailing, because the cost of violations is low compared to the cost of compliance. The result is that buildings in nominally code-compliant jurisdictions may actually be built to standards far below what the codes specify. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan, occurring in a jurisdiction with stringent codes and strong enforcement, killed approximately 15,900 people. An earthquake of similar magnitude in a jurisdiction with weaker code enforcement and less careful construction would likely kill substantially more. The problem of informal settlements and unplanned development adds another dimension to the seismic risk in major cities, particularly in developing countries. In cities like Istanbul, Mexico City, Lima, and many others in South America, Africa, and Asia, a significant fraction of the population lives in informal settlements, areas that developed without official urban planning, without building permits, without seismic code compliance. In some cases, these settlements occupy highly hazardous locations, areas of steep slopes prone to landsliding, areas of poor soil that experience liquefaction during earthquakes, areas immediately adjacent to known fault lines. The buildings in these settlements are often constructed with minimal structural engineering, concrete blocks or adobe bricks held together with inadequate mortar, roofs of corrugated metal or inadequate wooden frames, minimal or absent lateral bracing. In a major earthquake, these structures fail comprehensively, and because they are densely packed and occupy areas where official emergency response systems may have difficulty operating, the death toll per square kilometer can be catastrophic. The 2010 Haiti earthquake, magnitude 7.0, occurred in a region with minimal building code enforcement and extensive informal settlement. The death toll exceeded 200,000 people, one of the deadliest earthquakes in modern history. A similar magnitude earthquake in a well-built city like Tokyo would likely kill fewer than 5,000 people, perhaps fewer than 1,000. The difference is not in the earthquake itself, but in the building stock that the earthquake shakes. The concept of earthquake early warning systems, as opposed to earthquake prediction systems, represents a more modest and more achievable approach to reducing earthquake casualties. An early warning system does not predict that an earthquake will occur. It detects an earthquake that is already occurring, rapidly calculates its parameters, and sends warnings to areas that will experience shaking in the next 10 to 60 seconds, depending on distance from the epicenter and the speed of seismic waves. For a person in the area that will experience shaking, an early warning system provides time, perhaps only seconds, perhaps up to 30 or 40 seconds, to take protective action, to move away from windows, to get under a desk or table, to grab onto something stable to avoid being knocked down, to stop an elevator or train if the warning indicates very strong shaking. The warning cannot prevent the earthquake or prevent damage to buildings, but it can prevent certain types of injuries and deaths related to occupant motion. Early warning systems are particularly effective for reducing injuries that occur when people fall from heights or are struck by falling objects, and less effective for reducing injuries that occur from building collapse or from objects being thrown by very strong shaking. The first functional earthquake early warning system was deployed in Mexico in 1999. Japan implemented a national system in 2002, following the 2001 Gayo earthquake, and the system has been continuously refined and expanded since then. The United States Geological Survey deployed Shake Alert in California, Oregon, and Washington beginning in 2018. Turkey has developed an early warning system for the areas at risk from the North Anatolian Fault. These systems require dense networks of seismic instruments located close enough to population centers to provide meaningful warning time, and they require integration with communication systems to reach the population in time for them to act on the warning. When working properly, they save lives, though the number of lives saved is typically measured in tens or hundreds per event rather than thousands. The question of economic recovery from major earthquakes, the challenge of rebuilding a city's economy after a catastrophic event, reveals another aspect of seismic risk that is often not discussed in technical discussions of building engineering. When an earthquake destroys significant portions of a city's infrastructure, the economic impact extends far beyond the direct cost of repairing and replacing buildings. The disruption of transportation networks disrupts commerce. Goods cannot be moved, services cannot be provided.
The disruption of utilities, water, electric power, natural gas, prevents businesses from operating and prevents people from living normally. The disruption of supply chains extends the impact to regions beyond the earthquake's immediate area. The 1995 Kobe earthquake disrupted the production of computer chips that were manufactured in Kobe's industrial districts, affecting computer manufacturers around the world months after the earthquake. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake, combined with the tsunami and the nuclear accident, disrupted the global supply of rare earth elements and components used in electronics manufacturing. The economic loss from a megathrust earthquake affecting the Pacific Northwest is estimated at over $1 trillion in direct losses, and the indirect economic losses, the disruption of commerce, the cost of long-term recovery, the lost productivity, could be many times that amount. For a region or nation with limited economic reserves, recovery from such an earthquake could require decades and could essentially reset the region's economic development trajectory backward by years or decades. The question of seismic risk and national development strategy is rarely discussed openly, but is implicit in many governmental decisions about where to build, where to invest, and what priority to place on seismic preparedness. A developing country with limited capital and pressing immediate needs, poverty reduction, healthcare expansion, education system development, faces a difficult choice when confronted with seismic risk. Should the government invest in retrofit of existing buildings and strengthen design of new buildings? Or should it invest that capital in schools and hospitals and water treatment systems that address immediate needs? The answer, from an economic development perspective, is often to prioritize immediate needs and accept the seismic risk as an inevitable cost of development. This is not an irrational choice. It reflects the reality that the benefits of development are immediate and certain, while the costs of the earthquake are in the future and uncertain, in timing if not in occurrence. It reflects the reality that people living in poverty face immediate mortal threats from disease and malnutrition that are statistically more likely to affect them in their lifetime than a major earthquake. A government that diverts resources from healthcare and education to seismic preparedness is implicitly accepting that some people will die from preventable disease and inadequate education in order to reduce the number of people who will die when the inevitable earthquake occurs. These are tragic choices, and there is no right answer to them, only different ways of accepting loss. The role of international cooperation and technology transfer in seismic preparedness has become more significant in recent decades as the scientific understanding of seismic hazard has improved and as the technology for earthquake-resistant design has become more standardized. Countries that have experienced major earthquakes and developed sophisticated response mechanisms have, to some extent, been willing to share that knowledge and technology with other nations facing similar hazards. Japan has shared its early warning system technology and expertise with other countries. The United States Geological Survey has provided paleoseismic expertise and training to Turkish, Mexican, and Chilean seismologists. The World Bank has funded retrofits of critical infrastructure in developing countries at risk from earthquakes. However, the scale of international assistance is, in most cases, insufficient to address the scale of the problem. The number of buildings worldwide that are built to inadequate seismic standards and that pose risk in a future earthquake, is measured in hundreds of millions. The cost of retrofitting even a fraction of these buildings to modern standards exceeds what international cooperation can realistically provide. The problem, therefore, remains fundamentally a problem that each nation must address with its own resources. And for many developing nations, the resources available are insufficient. The advances in understanding fault behavior and earthquake recurrence that paleoseismology has provided have not fundamentally changed the basic problem of living on a tectonically active planet. They have simply made the problem visible in greater detail. Before paleoseismology matured as a discipline, a city could potentially claim ignorance. The geological record was unknown, the likelihood of major earthquakes was uncertain, the risk was abstract. By the early 21st century, no city could make this claim. For Istanbul, Cascadia, California, Tokyo, and dozens of other locations, the paleoseismic record had revealed the pattern of major earthquakes with enough clarity that anyone with access to scientific literature could understand the risk. Yet the response to this knowledge has been, in most cases, to acknowledge the risk while continuing to operate as if the risk were not as severe as the science indicated. The recognition that catastrophe is inevitable does not typically produce the radical reorganization of society that one might naively expect. Instead, it produces a slow, incremental tightening of standards, a gradual improvement in preparedness, a gradual acceptance that some losses are inevitable. The psychological literature on how people and institutions respond to known but temporally distant risks provides some insight into this seemingly paradoxical behavior. People are capable of being viscerally frightened by immediate threats, but have much greater difficulty maintaining fear or taking action in response to distant threats, no matter how certain those threats may be. When scientists announced in the 1990s that the Cascadia subduction zone would produce a major earthquake and that this earthquake was overdue by some measures, the public response in the Pacific Northwest was, initially, significant alarm. Within a few years, that alarm had faded. The earthquake had not occurred. The streets of Seattle and Portland had not visibly changed. The immediate concern of daily life, employment, relationships, current challenges, reasserted itself as the dominant focus of attention. The knowledge that a major earthquake would eventually occur remained, but it operated more as background knowledge than as an immediate trigger for action. This is not a failure of rationality, but a reflection of how human cognition works. Past a certain point of uncertainty about timing, even highly probable future events are psychologically discounted in favor of immediate present concerns. The role of memory, both institutional memory and personal memory, in determining how societies respond to seismic hazard cannot be overstated. In regions where major earthquakes occur frequently enough that most adults in the population have experienced one or more significant events, seismic preparedness is typically substantially better than in regions where major events are separated by many decades or centuries. Turkey experienced major earthquakes in 1999 and 2003, and the memory of these events remained vivid enough that building code compliance and seismic retrofits accelerated in the years following. Mexico experienced major earthquakes in 1985 and 2017, with 32 years separating them, and the 1985 earthquake had receded enough into historical distance that the 2017 earthquake, while certainly remembered, did not carry the same visceral impact it would have had if it had occurred within a decade of the previous event. Japan, with frequent earthquakes, maintains seismic preparedness partly because the earthquakes are frequent enough that memory of them remains current in the institutional structures, even when individual memories have faded. The Cascadia region, with its last major earthquake 325 years in the past, has the particular problem that personal memory is entirely absent, institutional memory is absent, oral traditions have been disrupted, and the only evidence of the earthquake is the geological record. Building a culture of seismic preparedness in such a region is profoundly difficult because there is no living memory to reinforce the importance of the preparation. The question of how much of a city's economic resources should be devoted to seismic preparedness versus other priorities becomes increasingly acute as climate change begins to produce additional hazards: flooding, storm surge, heat extremes that compete with seismic hazard for attention, investment, and resources. A city like Istanbul faces simultaneous risks from earthquakes, from sea level rise, and increased storm surge due to climate change, and from water scarcity. A city like coastal California faces simultaneous risks from earthquakes and from increased wildfire danger due to climate change. A city like Tokyo faces simultaneous seismic risks and risks from typhoon-driven storm surge. The resources that can be devoted to hazard mitigation are not infinite, and decisions about how to allocate those resources must account for multiple hazards with different probabilities and different time horizons. In most cases, the emphasis has been on addressing the most immediate and visible hazard, rather than the ones with longer time horizons. A drought is immediately visible. A wildfire season is immediately visible. An earthquake that may occur at an unknown future date is less immediately visible, and therefore often receives lower priority despite potentially being more catastrophic. The optimal allocation of resources across multiple hazards is not a technical problem. It is a social and political problem, and different societies have made different choices about how to balance these competing risks. The question that ultimately emerges from a careful study of fault behavior, paleoseismic history, and the response of human societies to seismic hazard is whether it is possible to build a sustainable civilization on a tectonically active planet, or whether there is something fundamentally at odds between the timescales on which civilizations operate and the timescales on which tectonic hazards manifest. Civilizations typically plan on timescales of decades to centuries. The primary tectonic hazards operate on timescales of centuries to millennia. This creates an inherent mismatch. The civilizational timescale is short enough that one can reasonably hope to avoid encountering the hazard during the civilization's current epoch, but long enough that completely rebuilding the civilization at a different location is not a realistic option. We are therefore committed to occupying the same locations, on the same faults, indefinitely. We build, the faults rupture, we rebuild, the faults rupture again, and the cycle continues. This is not a problem that has a solution. It is a condition that must be accepted. What seismology and paleoseismology have taught us is that this acceptance must be informed. It must be based on understanding the true magnitude and frequency of the hazard, not on optimistic assumptions. It must be based on the recognition that the catastrophe will come, not on the assumption that we have found a way to prevent it. And it must be based on a commitment to reducing the magnitude of the disaster as much as possible, given the constraints of living in the locations we have chosen to inhabit. The next Cascadia megathrust earthquake will reshape the Pacific Northwest. It will kill thousands of people, injure tens of thousands, displace hundreds of thousands, and cause economic damage in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Nothing that can be done will prevent this earthquake or prevent all of the damage that it will cause. What can be done is to ensure that when it occurs, and it will occur, the only uncertainty is when, the casualties and damage will be as small as can be achieved through engineering and preparedness. The same is true for the faults beneath Istanbul, California, Tokyo, and dozens of other cities. The faults will rupture. The cities will be shaken. Some people will die. What matters is how many die, whether the essential systems of the city can continue to function, whether the infrastructure can be recovered,
and whether the population can continue to exist as a coherent community in the aftermath. These are not matters of preventing the disaster, they are matters of surviving it. The history of seismology is, in many ways, a history of learning to live with uncertainty while simultaneously reducing that uncertainty as much as possible.
We cannot predict when an earthquake will occur with precision sufficient to allow evacuation. We can estimate the probability of occurrence within a time window measured in years or decades. We cannot prevent earthquakes. We can build structures that survive them. We cannot eliminate the risk that civilization faces from tectonically active faults. We can reduce that risk incrementally through better understanding and better engineering. What we cannot do, and what no amount of scientific advance will make possible, is to live on a tectonically active planet without eventually encountering tectonic hazards. The choice is not whether to accept risk, but how much risk to accept and how much resources to invest in reducing that risk. That choice, ultimately, is a social and political choice, not a scientific one. Science can inform the choice by revealing what the true magnitude of the hazard is. Science can provide options for reducing the hazard. But science cannot make the choice about how society should live with the hazards that are inherent to inhabiting the Earth. The recognition that major faults will rupture again, that Istanbul will experience another Marmara earthquake, that the San Francisco Bay Area will experience another major San Andreas rupture, that the Pacific Northwest will experience another Cascadia megathrust, that Japan will experience another megathrust on one of its subduction zones, is not a pessimistic recognition. It is simply a recognition of what the geological record demonstrates. The question is not whether these earthquakes will happen, but what kind of world will exist when they do. That world will be shaped by the choices made today about how to build, how to prepare, how to invest in resilience. It will be shaped by the decisions made by governments about building codes and emergency response. It will be shaped by decisions made by engineers about how to design structures. It will be shaped by decisions made by individuals about where to live and how to prepare for the inevitable. Those choices, taken together, will determine whether the next great earthquake reshapes the civilization that built on the faults, or whether the civilization, through preparation and resilience, can endure the reshaping that the fault will impose. The Nojima Fault that ruptured on January 18, 1995, has continued to accumulate stress since that rupture, just as it did for the 1,000 years preceding it. The current stress level is estimated to be approximately 30 to 40% of the maximum stress that preceded the 1995 event, which means another 500 to 1,000 years will likely pass before the fault again contains sufficient stress to rupture catastrophically. Kobe has been rebuilt. The population has returned. The economic activity has resumed. Children born after 1995 have grown up in a city that is functionally indistinguishable from any other modern Japanese city. And for them, the earthquake is history rather than living memory. In a few decades, when those children become the dominant population cohort, even that memory will fade. The city will continue to operate under the assumption that it will not experience another devastating earthquake in the foreseeable future, even though the geological record shows that devastating earthquakes on the Nojima Fault occur approximately every 1,000 years, and the city was built in such a way that it will be destroyed if that 1,000-year event occurs during the time the city exists. This is not a failure of knowledge or of engineering. This is simply the human condition on a tectonically active planet. The San Andreas Fault continues to accumulate stress at approximately 46 millimeters per year. The next major rupture in the San Francisco segment will occur when the accumulated stress exceeds the strength of the rocks comprising the fault. That rupture could occur tomorrow or could occur in 150 years. The probability of it occurring within the next 30 years is estimated at approximately 41%, a probability that is high by seismic standards, but not so high as to make the event occur with certainty. San Francisco will continue to be built, rebuilt, and inhabited regardless of this probability.
People will continue to choose to live there because of the economic and cultural advantages of the location. The city will prepare for the earthquake as best it can, knowing that preparation is incomplete and that the earthquake, when it comes, will exceed in some ways what the preparation anticipated. This is rational. This is what civilizations do. They build on the faults. They prepare for the inevitable. They accept that some catastrophe will come, and they work to ensure that the catastrophe, when it comes, is as small as it can be. Istanbul continues to grow. The population approaches 18 million. The buildings continue to be constructed. The seismic risk assessment continues to indicate a 40 to 65% probability of a magnitude 7 or greater earthquake within 30 years. The city continues to operate on a timescale measured in years and decades, accumulating infrastructure and population and economic activity, while the fault beneath the Marmara Sea continues to operate on a timescale measured in centuries. When the fault ruptures, and it will rupture, the only question is when. The city will be tested in a way that no amount of engineering or preparation can fully anticipate. Some of the city will survive, some of the city will be destroyed, some of the population will live, some will die.
And when the immediate crisis has passed and the long rebuilding has begun, the question will arise again. Should Istanbul be relocated, rebuilt elsewhere, abandoned to the fault? And the answer, just as it has been in Kobe and San Francisco and Tokyo and everywhere else, will be no. The city will be rebuilt in the same location because the location, despite its seismic danger, has advantages that outweigh the risk, and the cycle will continue. This is the reality of human civilization on a tectonically active planet. We build. The faults rupture. We rebuild. The faults rupture again. We accept that this will happen and prepare as best we can. We do not prevent the earthquakes because earthquakes cannot be prevented. We cannot move the cities because the cities are embedded in economic and social systems that cannot be easily relocated. We cannot protect ourselves completely from the consequences because the earthquakes, when they come, will in some ways exceed what we have prepared for. What we can do is reduce the number of people who die, reduce the damage to the built environment, accelerate recovery, maintain the continuity of civilization through the disaster. This is not prevention. This is survival. And survival, for a species living on a planet whose interior is still cooling and whose surface is still rearranging itself through tectonic forces, is the only realistic goal. The next great earthquake will come. The cities on the faults will be shaken. Some will fall. Some will stand. And after the dust settles and the rebuilding begins, human civilization will continue, as it has continued through countless previous earthquakes, because human civilization is not ultimately about the buildings or the infrastructure. It is about the continuation of human communities despite whatever the Earth chooses to do with them. That is what the paleoseismic record reveals when examined carefully. That is what the geological timescale teaches, and that is what remains. When all the scientific knowledge and all the engineering and all the preparation is stripped away, the simple, stubborn fact that human beings will build on the faults, will live on the faults, will be shaken by the faults, and will rebuild and continue living because the alternative, abandoning the productive parts of the Earth in order to avoid seismic risk, is not something that human civilization has ever done or seems likely to do. We are committed to the faults. The faults are committed to rupturing, and we will continue this dance together, for as long as the planet's interior remains hot enough to drive the tectonic processes that reshape the surface on which we have built our precarious and beautiful and fragile cities.